Thank you, Mr. Alvin Mosioma, for taking off time to talk to CRTV News. You are the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa, yes. And you're organizing the 5th media training for African journalists in Yaoundé, Cameroon. Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Can you give us an idea, why is it important to focus the attention of African journalists on illicit financial flows?
Because the illicit financial flows poses one of the greatest impediment to Africa's development. If you look at the Agenda 2063 and the aspirations under this agenda is that Africa and African countries should be able to finance development from their own pockets. That means that African countries are expected to generate domestic revenue through taxation to raise the necessary financial resources for that matter. But what we note that this cannot happen, and it's not possible if we don't tackle the challenges of illicit financial flows. Studies, particularly by the high-level panel on illicit financial flows that was set up by the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, indicated that African countries lose up to $50 billion as a result of illicit financial flows, and 60% of these loss is a result of commercial activities of multinational companies. Those basically through the practice of tax evasion and tax avoidance, African countries are losing huge resources. They would need to invest in social programs, in healthcare, in education, in infrastructure, and others. But this conversation is at the moment limited to experts. We see this conversation only happening within very high-level political forums. And we feel that the public need to be involved in this conversation. And here we see the media playing an important role, and that's why we as Tax Justice Network Africa.
To you, who is guilty, who is to blame for these illicit financial flows?
I think that it's difficult to blame shift. I think on one side, at the domestic level, what we see is that many African countries have very weak laws, laws that allow companies to bend or break them. They have significant capacity challenges in terms of the institutions that are charged with the responsibility of collecting revenues. That's at the domestic level. But globally, we also see that Africa is operating from a disadvantaged position because the playing field is not level. That particularly the rich countries are able to design a global financial system that is to their advantage, that allows particularly multinational companies to shift profits to tax havens in different countries, hiding those profits there, and therefore denying the African countries the resources that, as I said earlier, they need for investment.
From Ken Saro-Wiwa to Norbert Zongo, we know this is dangerous work, more or less, when you take on multinationals. Right. Are you taking this risk factor into account? And do you feel that your trainees are, at the end of the day, going to be equipped with the right tools to cope in such a hostile environment?
Our forefathers went to the forest, went to the bushes to fight for the political freedoms of this country. But for us to have the actual economic independence, we also need to be fearless. We need to say things as they are. We need to expose some of the practices of these multinational companies, many of them that are known to deliberately plan their structures in a manner that they don't pay taxes in the regions and countries where they operate. And I think that the solutions lie in collaboration. The solutions lie in the media playing its role as the fourth estate. It lies in citizens being mobilized and demanding accountabilities from their own government, because if we don't do that, we will be caught up in this vicious cycle of poverty that is plaguing the continent.
You mentioned in your opening remark of the training that it is not just the governments or even the leaders who are responsible, but all of us. How do you feel we can drive home that message to each and every one that they more or less have a role to play in their immediate environments?
I mean, tax is a social contract. Tax is a social contract between citizens and their government. And therefore, the citizens have the right to demand accountability from their governments. They have the right to demand that there is fair tax policies, that the burden of tax is not shifted to those people that are in the lower economic categories, but those that are wealthy, that the multinational companies that in many countries are enjoying significant tax incentives in addition to the taxes that they evade or avoid. And I think that the citizens here need to raise their voice, and we are seeing these things happen in a number of countries, that citizens are mobilizing themselves to demand some reforms from government. And so I am very optimistic that the task might seem complicated, but a wise man once said that the tree we plant and water today will provide a shade not for us but for our great grandchildren.
Thank you very much, Alvin Mosioma, Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa, for taking off time to talk to CRTV News.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.